My name is Sam Kirby. I'm 63 years old, and for 30 of those years, I was a Texas Ranger. I've seen the worst of what people can do to each other. I've stood over crime scenes that would turn a normal person's stomach and not felt a thing except a cold sense of duty. I've tracked men through the Big Bend for days, lived on coffee and jerky, and felt more at home in the grit and the dust than I ever did in a city. When I retired, I thought I'd seen it all. I thought I understood the boundaries of the world. I was wrong. I bought a piece of land out in the deep East Texas woods, not too far from the Sabine National Forest. It was 100 acres of dense pine and oak, with a small, sturdy farmhouse set a good half-mile back from the county road. It was the end of a long gravel drive, and my nearest neighbor was 5 miles away. That's how I liked it. The quiet was the point. After a lifetime of sirens and shouting, the sound of the wind in the pines was the only music I needed. The house was old but solid, built from timber milled on the property a century ago. It had a wide front porch and a stone fireplace, and I spent the first year of my retirement reinforcing it, updating the wiring, and making it my own. It was my fortress of solitude. The events I'm about to recount happened 2 years ago, in late October. The air was starting to get a crisp edge to it at night, and the days were warm and golden. My daughter, Alyssa, and her husband, Cal, were driving in from Houston for the weekend. Cal was a good man, an engineer, steady and smart. He'd brought along a friend of his from work, a guy named Brian. I'd met Brian once or twice before. He was one of those perpetually cheerful, loud types who saw everything as a joke. He wasn't a bad person, just a city person. He didn't have the quiet respect for the wild that people who live in it tend to develop. They arrived late Friday afternoon in Cal's big Ford F-150, spilling out into my gravel driveway with coolers and bags. Brian was already making a crack about how far out in the sticks I lived, asking if I had to fight off bears to get my mail. I just smiled and told him the mailman was more afraid of my old dog Gus than any bear. Gus was a retired canine German shepherd, slowing down in his old age but still sharp. He was lying on the porch, his tail giving a few lazy thumps against the wood. We spent the evening like any normal family. I grilled steaks on the back patio, we drank a few beers, and Brian told work stories that were probably funnier if you were an engineer. Alyssa helped me in the kitchen, chattering about her job and her friends. It was comfortable. Normal. I remember looking out from the patio as dusk settled, the sky turning a bruised purple over the tops of the pine trees that crowded the edge of my property, and feeling a deep sense of peace. The woods were just the woods, a place of quiet and solitude. Later that night, long after we'd cleaned up and were sitting in the living room with the fire going, Gus started to get restless. He was lying by the hearth, but instead of sleeping, his head was up, his ears twitching. He let out a low, guttural growl, the kind I hadn't heard from him in years. It wasn't his usual, "someone's at the door" bark. This was a deep, chest-vibrating warning. "What's with the dog?" Brian asked, pausing mid-sentence. I put a hand on Gus's back. His muscles were coiled tight. "Easy, boy," I murmured. He was staring intently at the front window, which looked out over the dark yard and the wall of trees beyond. I listened. At first, all I heard was the crackle of the fire and the hum of the refrigerator. Then I heard it too. It was a sound from outside, far off but carrying clearly on the still night air. It was a deep, resonant thump, thump, thump. It was rhythmic, slow, like someone hitting a tree with a baseball bat. It went on for about a minute, then stopped. "What the hell is that?" Cal asked, his brow furrowed. He'd moved to the window, peering out into the darkness.
Probably a woodpecker, Brian laughed, but it was a little forced. A really, really big one. No woodpecker makes a sound like that. Not at night, I said, getting to my feet. Gus stayed glued to my side, still rumbling. Could be a buck rubbing its antlers on a tree, but it sounds too heavy. I was already cycling through the logical possibilities. Poachers? Teenagers messing around? The sound was odd, but not yet terrifying. Just out of place. We didn't hear it again for a while. The conversation picked back up, but the easy atmosphere was gone. We were all listening now, whether we wanted to admit it or not. About an hour later, a different sound started. It was a high-pitched, chittering sound, punctuated by a series of whoops.
It sounded like a pack of coyotes, but there was a strange, almost hysterical quality to it. It rose to a frantic crescendo, then cut off abruptly. Not faded away. It just stopped, as if a switch had been flipped. The silence that followed was heavier and more profound than the noise had been. "Okay, that's just coyotes," Brian announced, a little too loudly. "They always sound like they're murdering something." "Maybe," I said, but I didn't believe it. I've lived around coyotes my whole life. I know their sounds. This was different. The abrupt silence was what bothered me most. It was unnatural. The woods, even at night, are never truly silent. There are always insects, the rustle of small animals, the whisper of wind. But after that sound stopped, there was nothing. A complete and total deadening of all ambient noise. It was the kind of silence that feels like it's pressing in on you. Alyssa shivered, pulling a blanket tighter around her shoulders. "It's creepy out here, Dad." "It's just the woods, honey," I said, trying to reassure her, and maybe myself. "Everything sounds different when you're not used to it." But Gus was still on alert, his nose pointed toward the door, a low whine escaping his throat. He knew something I didn't. I trusted that dog's instincts more than I trusted my own ears. I made a mental note to take a walk around the property line in the morning, see if I could find any tracks. We decided to call it a night. I gave Cal and Alyssa my bedroom, and Brian took the spare room at the back of the house. I took the couch in the living room. It wasn't just about being a good host. I wanted to be near the main door, and near Gus. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I lay there for a long time, my old service revolver, a Colt Python, on the coffee table next to me. It was a habit I never broke, keeping a weapon close. Tonight, I was glad for it. I must have drifted off because I was jolted awake by a loud scraping sound. It was coming from the side of the house, a long, drawn-out screep of something hard and sharp being dragged against the wood siding. It was slow and deliberate. Gus shot to his feet, barking furiously now, a full-throated, aggressive roar that echoed through the small house. I grabbed the python and my flashlight and moved to the side window. The scraping stopped the moment Gus started barking. I clicked on the flashlight and aimed the beam out into the yard. Nothing. Just the manicured lawn giving way to the inky blackness of the trees. The motion-activated floodlight on that side of the house hadn't even come on. Cal appeared in the doorway of the bedroom, his face pale. "What was that?" "I don't know," I said, keeping my voice low. Something was up against the house. Gus was at the front door now, scratching at it, whining to be let out. He wanted to go after whatever it was. "No, boy, stay," I commanded. There was no way I was letting him run out there into the dark, not when I didn't know what we were dealing with. The instinct to protect him was as strong as the instinct to protect my own family. Brian stumbled out of his room, rubbing his eyes. "What's all the racket? Is it that giant woodpecker again?" "Quiet," I hissed. "Just listen." We stood there in the dark, the only sounds the ticking of the grandfather clock and Gus's heavy breathing. The silence from the woods was still absolute. It was as if the world stopped at my tree line. After 5 minutes of nothing, Brian scoffed. Probably a branch fell and scraped the side. This old house is probably falling apart. I knew it wasn't a branch. The sound was too rhythmic, too intentional. But arguing about it in the dark wasn't going to help. "Everybody go back to bed," I said. "I'll stay up for a while." They reluctantly agreed. Cal gave me a look that said he didn't believe the branch story either, but he took Alyssa back into the bedroom. I waited until I heard their door close, then I went back to the couch. I didn't go back to sleep. I sat there in the dark, the heavy weight of the python in my hand, and I watched the windows. The sun rose the next morning on a perfectly normal world. The birds were singing, the air was clean and cool. Gus was calm again. It was almost possible to believe we'd imagined the whole thing. Almost. After a quick breakfast of coffee and toast, Cal and I went outside to inspect the side of the house. Brian tagged along, still in a joking mood, saying he wanted to see the giant beaver chew marks. He stopped joking when we found them. There were 3 long, deep gouges in the thick wood siding. They ran parallel to each other, starting about 7 feet off the ground and dragging down for about 4 feet before they stopped. The wood was splintered and shredded, raw and new against the weathered gray paint. I ran my fingers over them. They were about 1 inch wide and at least a 1/2 inch deep. Whatever made them had been incredibly strong. "No branch did that," Cal said, his voice quiet. He looked up at the roofline. There were no overhanging trees. I knelt and looked at the ground beneath the marks. The grass was damp with dew, but there were no clear tracks. Just a few areas where the grass was pressed down, as if something very heavy had stood there. And the motion-activated light directly above us was busted. The plastic housing was cracked and the bulb was shattered, but the fixture itself was bent downward, as if something had swatted it from above. Brian was silent for the first time all morning. He just stared at the marks, then at the height they started. "What the hell?" he whispered. "A bear," I said, thinking aloud. "A big one, standing on its hind legs. It's the only thing that makes sense." But even as I said it, it felt wrong. The marks were too clean, too parallel. They looked like they were made by claws, yes, but claws guided by a purpose. And a bear wouldn't have just swatted the light. It would have mauled the whole fixture. This looked more like a targeted, precise act of vandalism. "We should leave, Dad," Alyssa said. She had come out onto the porch and was looking at the marks with wide, fearful eyes. "I don't like this." "We're not going to get run off our own property by a stray bear," I said, my old ranger stubbornness kicking in. "Cal, you and I will walk the perimeter, see if we can find where it came from. Brian, you stay here with Alyssa. Lock the doors." Brian, for once, didn't argue. He just nodded, his face looking pasty. The reality of the physical evidence had finally sunk in. I went inside and grabbed my hunting rifle, a lever-action Marlin in .45-70. It's a brush gun meant for stopping big, dangerous game at close range. I slung it over my shoulder and Cal and I started our walk, with Gus trotting nervously ahead of us. We started at the back of the property, working our way around the edge of the woods. For the first half hour we found nothing, just the usual signs of deer and rabbits. Then Gus started getting agitated again. He stopped near a thicket of yopon holly, the fur on his back standing up, a low growl in his throat. He wouldn't go any further. "What is it, boy?" I asked, moving forward cautiously, the rifle now in my hands. Cal pointed. "Sam, look." Just inside the tree line there was a deer, or what was left of one. It was a large doe, and it had been torn apart. Not eaten, torn apart. Its legs were wrenched from their sockets at grotesque angles. Its torso was ripped open. but the organs were mostly untouched, just spilled onto the pine needles. The head was missing entirely. I've seen my share of animal kills. Coyotes are messy. A cougar is clean, surgical. A bear will maul and feed. This was none of those. This was rage. It was a display of sheer, brutal strength for no discernible reason. There were no feeding marks. It was just destruction. No bear did this, Cal said, his voice barely a whisper. This is wrong. He was right. And then I saw the tracks. They were in a patch of soft mud near the carcass. They were huge, bigger than any bear track I'd ever seen. And they weren't the right shape. They were long, almost like a human foot, but with a distinct canine-like structure, ending in deep impressions from what had to be massive claws. But the most disturbing part was the stride. There were 2 tracks, one in front of the other, separated by a good 6 feet. Whatever made them, it was walking on 2 legs. A cold dread, colder than any fear I'd felt on the job, settled in my stomach. I looked at Cal. His face was ashen. He was seeing the same thing I was. This wasn't an animal. Not one that we knew, anyway. Without another word, we turned and started walking back to the house, much faster than we had come. The woods no longer felt peaceful. They felt alien and hostile. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every snap of a twig made me spin around, the rifle coming up to my shoulder. When we got back to the house, I didn't mince words. "We're leaving," I told them. "Pack your bags, now." Alyssa's face was a mixture of fear and relief. Brian just stared at me. "What did you find?" "Something that shouldn't be here," I said grimly. "We'll be gone in 15 minutes. We moved fast. Alyssa and Cal threw their things into their bags.
Brian, who had seemed to regain some of his bravado inside the house, was moving slower. "Are we really running away because of some weird tracks? It was probably just some pranksters who bought monster feed online." "Brian, just get your stuff," Cal snapped, his patience gone. "This isn't a joke." I was in my bedroom, grabbing my wallet and keys, when I happened to glance out the back window. My blood ran cold. Standing at the far edge of the clearing, just at the tree line, was a figure. It was partially obscured by the shadows of the pines, but there was no mistaking it. It was massive, at least 7, maybe 8 feet tall. It was standing perfectly still, watching the house. It was too far to make out details, but the silhouette was all wrong. The shoulders were impossibly broad, the arms too long, hanging down almost to its knees. And it was standing on 2 legs that seemed to bend backward, like a dog's. I felt a primal fear grip me, an instinctual terror that bypassed all my training and experience. This was a predator, and we were its prey. "It's here," I said, my voice tight. "It's in the yard." Cal and Alyssa rushed to my side, crowding the window. Brian came up behind them. "Oh my God," Alyssa breathed. The figure took a step out of the shadows. Even from 100 yards away, its form was horrifyingly clear in the afternoon light. It had a coat of coarse, dark fur, somewhere between black and gray. Its body was a nightmarish fusion of man and beast, with the powerful, digitigrade legs of a canine and a torso that was brutally muscular, almost like a bodybuilder's. But the head was the worst part. It was purely canine, a long, tapered snout like a wolf or a shepherd, with pointed ears that stood erect on top of its head. It turned its head slowly, scanning the house, and I could have sworn, even from that distance, that I saw the glint of intelligence in its eyes.
"That's not real," Brian stammered, his voice trembling. "That can't be real." As if it heard him, the creature lowered its head and let out a sound that wasn't a bark or a howl. It was a deep,
resonant growl that seemed to vibrate in the glass of the window pane. Gus, who was inside with us, went berserk, throwing himself against the back door, barking and snarling with a ferocity I'd never seen. "Get away from the windows," I yelled, shoving them back. "Everyone, into the living room, now! Stay in the center of the house." I ran to the back door and dragged Gus away, locking the deadbolt and shoving a heavy armchair in front of it. Cal was already doing the same to the front door. The casual weekend had just turned into a siege. My mind was racing, falling back on old training. Secure the perimeter, assess the threat, find a weapon.
"Cal, check all the windows. Make sure they're locked," I ordered. "Alyssa, call 911. Alyssa fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking. "There's no signal," she cried. "None of our phones have a signal." Of course. The cell service was spotty at best out here. I had a landline, but as I moved toward it, I glanced out the kitchen window and saw why the phones were dead. A thick black cable, the main telephone line, was dangling from the pole near the driveway. It had been cleanly severed. "It cut the phone line," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. This wasn't a dumb animal. It was smart. It was isolating us. Brian was starting to panic, pacing back and forth. "What is that thing? What does it want?" "I don't know," I said, chambering around in the marlin. "But it's not here to be friendly. We need to stay calm and stay together." The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. The beautiful sunset now felt like a countdown timer.
Darkness was its ally, not ours. The house fell silent again, but this time it was a taut, terrified silence. We were all listening, waiting for the next move. It came in the form of a heavy thud against the front of the house, then another, and another. It was throwing rocks, not pebbles, grapefruit-sized stones that hit the wood siding with enough force to shake the walls. It was testing us, seeing how we would react. "Don't go near the windows," I warned again, my rifle pointed toward the front door. Cal stood beside me, armed with a heavy fireplace poker. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Then, a crash of shattering glass came from the back of the house. Brian screamed. We spun around to see him standing near the spare bedroom, staring at the window he'd been sleeping next to. A large rock lay on the floor amidst a sea of broken glass. The creature had found a weak spot. "I've told you to stay in the middle of the room," I roared, a surge of anger cutting through my fear. "It's just trying to scare us," Brian yelled back, his voice cracking with hysteria. "They're just goddamn pranksters in a suit." He took a step toward the broken window, cupping his hands around his mouth. "Hey, you hear me? The joke's over. You're going to jail." "Brian, no!" Cal and I shouted at the same time. It was too late. As Brian leaned toward the window frame, a long, black arm, impossibly fast, shot through the opening. It wasn't covered in fur. It was leathery, like black skin, and ended in a hand that was almost human, but with fingers that were too long and tipped with thick, yellowed claws. The hand clamped down on the front of Brian's shirt. He let out a choked, terrified scream. He tried to pull back, but the thing's grip was absolute. With a sound of tearing fabric and a sickening crunch, it yanked him forward. His head hit the window frame with a wet crack, and then he was gone, pulled out into the darkness. His scream was cut short, replaced by a wet, gurgling sound, and then silence. We stood frozen for a second, paralyzed by the sheer horror and speed of what had just happened. Alyssa let out a long, wailing sob, collapsing onto the floor. Cal rushed to her, pulling her into his arms, his own face a mask of disbelief and terror. The shock broke and rage took its place, pure, hot rage. I ran to the broken window, the marlin up to my shoulder, and peered out. I saw a flash of movement as a massive, dark shape dragged something away into the trees. I fired 2 shots, the roar of the .45-70 deafening in the enclosed space. I didn't know if I hit it. I didn't care. I just needed to shoot. "It's got him," I said, my voice hollow. "It took him." The reality of our situation crashed down on us with the weight of a physical blow. This wasn't a game. This wasn't a prank. This was a hunt, and we were trapped in the hunting ground. "We have to get out of here," Cal said, his voice shaking but firm. He was trying to be strong for Alyssa, who was rocking back and forth, muttering Brian's name. "We can't," I said, my mind racing through the tactical realities. "It's dark. It's out there, waiting. It's faster than us, stronger than us. The house is our only defense. We have to hold out until morning." "Hold out? Sam, it pulled him through a window." "We barricade," I said, my voice taking on the command tone I hadn't used in years. "We make it impossible for it to get in. Cal, help me. We move the heavy furniture, block every door, every window." For the next hour, we worked like people possessed. We dragged the heavy oak dining table and wedged it against the front door. We pushed a massive bookshelf in front of the shattered window, blocking the opening. We moved dressers, cabinets, anything heavy, and shoved them against the walls under the remaining windows. We were creating a fortress within our fortress. Alyssa, her initial shock giving way to a desperate survival instinct, helped us, her small frame straining with the effort. Gus paced the perimeter of our shrinking safe zone, a constant, low growl in his chest. The house was now a cluttered mess, an obstacle course of furniture, but it felt safer. We huddled together in the center of the living room, the only light coming from a single, battery-powered lantern I kept for power outages. The darkness outside was now complete, and the sound started again. It was circling the house. We could hear its footsteps, heavy and deliberate, on the soft earth outside. A soft thump, crunch, thump, crunch. Then it started testing our defenses. A soft, metallic rattle from the front door. It was trying the doorknob, gently at first, then harder, shaking the entire door in its frame. The barricade groaned, but held. Then came the scraping again, this time on the roof. Long, slow drags of its claws across the shingles. It was looking for a way in, a way down. My heart hammered in my chest as I looked up at the ceiling, imagining that thing tearing its way through the attic. It stopped, and for a long time, there was silence again. The waiting was the worst part, the not knowing where it was, what it was planning. My ranger training taught me to analyze and predict an opponent's moves, but my opponent was always a man. How do you predict the actions of a monster? Then, a new sound. A soft, plaintive whimpering coming from the back of the house. It sounded like a hurt puppy. Gus's ears perked up, and he let out a questioning whine. "Don't," I said to the dog, my voice a harsh whisper. The whimpering continued, then it changed. It began to morph, twisting into a different sound. A human voice. "Help me, please. It hurts." It was Brian's voice. Alyssa gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Cal stared at me, his eyes wide with horror and confusion. "It can't be." "It's not him," I said, my knuckles white on the stock of my rifle. "It's mimicking him. It's trying to lure us out." The voice grew more desperate. "Sam, Cal, for God's sake, open the door. It dropped me. My leg is broken. It's coming back." The mimicry was perfect. It was Brian's exact tone, his cadence, his panic. If I hadn't seen what I'd seen, I might have believed it. It was a level of cunning that was deeply, fundamentally terrifying. This creature wasn't just a brute, it was a thinking, strategic predator. It understood psychology. It understood cruelty. Alyssa started crying again, burying her face in Cal's chest. "Make it stop," she sobbed. "Please, make it stop." The voice outside kept pleading for another minute. Then it seemed to realize the trick wasn't working. The pleading stopped, replaced by a low, guttural chuckle. It was a sound of pure malice, a sound that promised pain. And then came the rage. A tremendous impact shook the entire house, coming from the back wall near the kitchen. It was a sound of splintering wood and raw, unrestrained power. It was hitting the house with its full body weight. Boom! The pictures on the walls rattled. Boom! A crack appeared in the plaster. It was trying to break through the wall itself. "It's coming through," Cal yelled. I ran to the kitchen, my heart pounding. The back door, a solid oak door I'd installed myself, was bulging inward, the frame splintering. The heavy pantry cabinet we'd shoved in front of it was rocking with each impact. Boom! The top hinge of the door tore loose from the frame with a scream of tortured metal. The door canted inward, held only by the bottom hinge and the deadbolt. A dark, leathery hand with those awful claws reached through the gap at the top, feeling around. I didn't think. I just reacted. I raised the Marlin and fired. The .45-70 round hit the hand dead center. The creature let out a deafening, high-pitched shriek of pain and rage, a sound that tore through the night. The hand vanished. There was a moment of silence, and I dared to hope it was retreating. Then, an even more furious assault began. It was no longer trying to be strategic. It was just trying to destroy the house around us. It threw its full weight against the door again and again. Wood splintered, the frame groaned, and with a final explosive crack, the door burst inward, sending the pantry cabinet sliding across the floor. Standing in the ruined doorway, silhouetted against the faint moonlight, was the monster. It was even bigger up close. Easily 8 feet tall, its head nearly scraping the top of the door frame. Its shoulders were so wide it had to turn sideways to squeeze through. The moonlight caught the glistening fur on its massive chest and the long, powerful muscles in its arms and legs. Its canine head was lowered, and its yellow eyes burned with a hateful intelligence. Its snout was wrinkled back in a snarl, revealing long, yellow fangs. The hand I had shot was bleeding a dark, thick fluid, but it didn't seem to slow it down. It just seemed to make it angrier. It took a step into the kitchen. Gus, my brave, foolish dog, charged. He launched himself at the creature's leg, sinking his teeth in. The monster barely seemed to notice. It looked down, annoyed, and kicked its leg with a casual, brutal flick of its foot. Gus was thrown across the room, hitting the wall with a sickening thud before falling to the floor in a heap, silent and still. A wave of grief and fury washed over me. I screamed, a wordless roar of pure hate, and emptied the Marlin into the creature's chest. I worked the lever action as fast as I could, the shots booming in the small space. 1, 2, 3, 4 rounds. The heavy slugs hit it with the force of a sledgehammer, staggering it backward. It grunted with each impact, but it didn't fall. It just looked at me, its burning eyes filled with surprise and then incandescent rage. It lunged. I had no time to reload. I threw the empty rifle at it and dove to the side as it crashed into the spot where I had been standing. Cal was there, swinging the fireplace poker like a madman, hitting the creature across its back. The heavy iron poker bent on impact, having no more effect than a twig.
The creature spun around, its long arm whipping out and catching Cal across the chest. He flew backward and hit the living room wall, slumping to the ground, the wind knocked out of him. It was just me and the monster. It turned its attention back to me, its eyes locking onto mine. It took a slow, deliberate step forward, a low growl rumbling in its chest. I scrambled backward, my hand searching for the python I'd left on the coffee table. My fingers closed around the familiar grip. The creature was almost on top of me. I could smell its breath, a foul, coppery stench of rot and blood. It reached for me with its good hand, its claws extended. I brought the python up, shoved it against the creature's side right below its rib cage, and pulled the trigger. The .357 Magnum round is a man-stopper. The boom was deafening. The creature roared, a sound of agony this time, and stumbled back a step. I fired again, and again. I emptied all 6 rounds into its torso as fast as I could pull the trigger. It staggered, clutching its side. It looked down at the wounds, then back up at me. The rage in its eyes was gone, replaced by something else. Shock? Maybe even fear. It let out a gurgling cough, and dark blood frothed at its snout. Then it did something I never would have expected. It turned, squeezed back through the ruined doorway, and fled into the darkness. It was wounded, badly, but it was still moving with a terrifying speed. The silence it left behind was absolute. For a moment, none of us moved. I was on the floor, the empty python still in my hand. Cal was groaning, pushing himself up. Alyssa was huddled in the corner, her eyes wide with shock. Then I remembered Gus. I scrambled over to where he lay. His breathing was shallow, his eyes were closed. I put my hand on his chest. A faint heartbeat. He was alive. "Cal," I said, my voice hoarse. "The truck, now." There was no more talk of waiting. We had to get out. We had to get out before that thing, or another one like it, came back. Cal stumbled to his feet, clutching his ribs. "The keys?" "In my pocket," I said. "Help me with Gus." Together, we gently lifted the heavy dog. He whimpered in pain. Alyssa, seeing a purpose, a way to act, scrambled to open the barricaded front door, shoving the table aside just enough for us to squeeze through. Stepping out onto the porch felt like stepping into another world. The night air was cold. The woods were silent. Every shadow was a monster. My truck was parked 100 feet away, a dark shape in the moonlight. It felt like a mile. "Alyssa, you go first," I ordered. "Get in the truck, unlock the doors. Cal and I are right behind you." She didn't hesitate. She ran, a frantic, desperate sprint across the lawn. The sound of her footsteps on the gravel seemed impossibly loud. She reached the truck, fumbled with the handle, and scrambled inside. Cal and I followed, carrying Gus between us. He was a dead weight. My whole body ached. Every step was an effort. My eyes were scanning the tree line, my ears straining for any sound of pursuit. The empty Colt was useless in my hand, but I couldn't bring myself to drop it. We reached the truck. We managed to get Gus onto the back seat, laying him gently across the bench. I got behind the wheel, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. Cal climbed into the passenger seat, his face pale and beaded with sweat. The engine turned over. The sound a glorious roar of hope in the terrifying silence. I slammed the truck into reverse, not even bothering with the headlights yet. I spun the wheel and stomped on the gas, the tires spitting gravel. As the truck swung around, the headlights automatically flashed on, illuminating the house for a brief second. The house was a wreck. The back door was a gaping black hole. The front door hung open. It looked violated, broken. My fortress. And for a split second, in the sweeping beam of the headlights,
I saw it again. It was standing at the edge of the woods, near where it had first appeared. It was leaning against a tree, watching us leave. It wasn't pursuing, it was just watching. Its head was low, and even from that distance, I could see the dark stains on its chest and side where I'd shot it. Our eyes met across the field, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. It was a look of cold, calculating hatred.
A promise that this wasn't over. I didn't wait to see more. I gunned the engine and we shot down the long gravel drive, fishtailing wildly. I didn't slow down until we hit the paved county road, and even then, I kept the needle pushed far over the speed limit. No one spoke. The only sounds were Alyssa's quiet sobs from the back seat, Cal's ragged breathing, and the pained whimpers of my dog. We drove for 20 minutes before we saw the first signs of civilization, the lights of a gas station at a crossroads. I didn't stop. I kept driving until we were in the town of Jasper, the county seat. I pulled into the parking lot of the sheriff's department, the building brightly lit under sterile fluorescent lights. It felt like reaching a different planet. I killed the engine, and for a long moment we all just sat there, the adrenaline starting to fade, replaced by a deep, trembling exhaustion and shock. We were alive. We had escaped. I was the first one to move.
I looked back at Alyssa. "Honey, are you okay?" She just shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Brian," she whispered. The reality of his death, which I had compartmentalized in the fight for survival, hit me full force. A young man was dead because he had come to my house for a barbecue. The weight of that guilt was crushing. Leaving Cal and Alyssa in the truck with Gus, I walked into the sheriff's department. The deputy at the front desk was a young kid who looked barely out of his teens. He looked up from his magazine, annoyed at the late-night intrusion. "Can I help you?" "I need to report an attack," I said, my voice flat and dead, "and a death. My name is Sam Kirby. I'm a retired Texas Ranger." That got his attention. He straightened up, his eyes widening. He showed me into a small, sterile interview room and went to get his superior. A few minutes later, a man in his late 50s with a tired face and a thick gray mustache walked in.
He introduced himself as Sheriff Miller. He knew who I was. We'd crossed paths a few times over the years. He listened patiently as I told him the story. I left nothing out. The sounds, the marks on the house, the tracks, the deer, the visual of the creature, the attack, Brian's death, the siege, the escape. I told it just as it happened, in the flat, repertorial tone of a man giving an official statement. I knew how it sounded. It sounded insane. When I was finished, he just sat there for a long time, looking at his hands. "Sam," he said finally, his voice gentle, "you've been through a major trauma. A man is missing, possibly dead. Your house has been attacked. That's a hell of a thing." "It wasn't a man, and it wasn't a bear," I said, my voice hardening. "You need to get a team out there, a heavily armed team. That thing is wounded. You might be able to track it." He sighed. "We'll send a unit out to your property at first light. We'll treat it as a missing person case with a possible animal attack. We'll get statements from your daughter and son-in-law. We'll get you all checked out at the hospital." It was a textbook, by-the-book answer. And it was a complete dismissal of everything I had just told him. "You don't believe me," I said. It wasn't a question. "I believe you're terrified," he said. "I believe something horrible happened out there. The mind plays tricks in situations like that. You see a bear in the dark, adrenaline pumping. It can look like anything." I stood up, my chair scraping against the linoleum. "I know what a bear looks like, Tom. I've hunted them.
This was not a bear. It cut my phone line. It mimicked a man's voice. It threw rocks. A bear doesn't do that. He just gave me a sad, pitying look, the look you give a crazy old man. I was a respected ranger for 30 years, and overnight I had become a crackpot. I knew then that there would be no help, no cavalry. We were on our own. The official investigation was a joke. They found Brian's t-shirt, torn and bloody, about 50 yards into the woods. They found tracks, which they identified in their report as unusually large, indeterminate prints, likely belonging to a black bear. They documented the damage to my house, also attributing it to a bear. Brian was officially listed as a missing person, victim of a suspected animal attack.
His body was never found. The case was closed within a week. Cal and Alyssa gave their statements, which corroborated mine, but they were treated as traumatized witnesses whose accounts were unreliable. The story of a bipedal wolf monster was politely noted and then buried in the file. The only person who seemed to take me seriously was an old deputy, a man even older than me, with watery blue eyes and a face like a worn-out road map. He caught me in the parking lot as I was leaving a few days later. "Kirby," he said, his voice low. He glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "You need to sell that farm. Don't go back there." I just looked at him.
My granddaddy was a logger in these parts, he continued, not looking at me. He used to talk about things, tall things in the woods that walked on two legs and had the heads of dogs. Said they were old things, older than the trees. Said you don't ever let them know where you live. He finally looked at me, his eyes full of a deep, ancient fear. "That thing you saw? It knows where you live now. It knows your face. You get out. You go somewhere with a lot of lights and a lot of people." He didn't wait for a reply. He just nodded once and walked away, leaving me standing there in the sun with a cold that went all the way to my bones. I took his advice. I sold the farm at a huge loss to a timber company that just wanted the land. I never stepped foot in the house again. I paid a moving company to clear it out. They told me the place was a wreck, that animals had gotten in. They mentioned a terrible smell in the kitchen. Gus survived. The vet said he had 3 broken ribs and a severe concussion, but he was a tough old dog. He recovered, but he was never the same. He was jumpy, nervous. He would stare at dark corners and growl at nothing. He died in his sleep a year later. I like to think he's at peace. It's been 2 years. Alyssa is in therapy for PTSD. She has nightmares. Cal won't talk about it. He just gets a haunted look in his eyes if the subject ever comes up. We lost something that night, more than just Brian. We lost our sense of the world as a known, rational place. The floor fell out from under us, and we saw what was crawling in the basement. I live in a suburb of San Antonio now. There are streetlights and neighbors and the constant hum of traffic. I haven't been in the woods since that night. I probably never will again. But I haven't found peace. I spend my nights online, falling down rabbit holes of folklore and cryptozoology, reading hushed, anonymous accounts from all over the country, stories of people who saw what I saw, stories of tall, canine-headed creatures that walk on 2 legs, that hunt with a terrifying intelligence. They call them dogmen. I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man in a suit. It was something else. Something ancient and predatory that lives in the dark spaces on the map. We built our towns and our highways and our cell towers, and we think we've tamed this world. We're wrong. We're just living in the brightly lit rooms of a very old, very dark house, and we've forgotten what's locked in the other rooms. That night, one of the doors opened. I don't tell this story for attention. I don't care if you believe me. The sheriff didn't. Most people wouldn't. I'm telling it because I have to. For Brian.
And as a warning, stay out of the deep woods.
Pay attention to that feeling you get when the birds go silent. Trust your dog when he tells you something is wrong, because there are things out there in the dark that are stronger, faster, and smarter than you are. And if you're unlucky enough to get their attention, you'll learn, as I did, that the world is much bigger and more terrifying than you were ever taught to believe. And some things, once they know who you are, they never forget. The memory of that night, of those yellow eyes, it followed me home, and I know it will be with me until the day I die.